Get going here. Welcome to all of you. My name is William Hurlbut. I'm a professor in the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford University, and I'm the leader of the project that is co-sponsoring this conference, the Stanford project entitled The Boundaries of Humanity, Humans, Animals, and Machines in the Age of Biotechnology. We have a very interesting and well complementary panel of speakers today. I'm going to give you very brief introductions. Megan Levis is a postdoctoral fellow in computer science and engineering at Notre Dame. Dillon Stull is a fifth-year medical student at Stanford, with whom I had the privilege of mentoring what they call a Med Scholars project on chimeras and organoids. So that was, so I know Dillon quite well. And Father Michael Baggot is currently an assistant professor of bioethics at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome. So what is our subject today? We are going to look at the challenges implied by advancing biotechnology. In the last session in this room, we looked at the evolutionary forces that have formed us, and now we're going to bridge over into the challenging question of what are we going to do now that some of those forces are coming into our hands through technological advances? This places us right squarely in a sort of exalted or newly enhanced position of co-creators. It's taking us back a little beyond being the tiller and the keeper of the garden to remaking the garden and, more importantly, perhaps remaking ourselves. One of our talks is going to be focused first, the first talk, on genetic engineering, the stewardship and creativity as the central axis of that. Dillon is going to talk to us about chimera creations, and that implies the question of the very definition of human life and, of course, how we could knock it off kilter or how we could disrespect it. And then finally, we're going to conclude with a very important overarching question, and that is, how do we know? How do we know anything? How do we understand the world? And most importantly, how do we understand ourselves? So that with these new powers of biotechnology, we can together say with St. Francis, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessing. Please welcome Megan Levis.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to the organizers for having me speak today. I'm going to begin by talking to you guys about bioengineering and co-creation. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let me check this out. Okay, great. So I just want to begin by talking about some systems that we are currently creating in bioengineering research, and then we're going to get in and talk a little bit about the ethics of them, but we're going to begin with a broad overview here. So first, we have, in talking about engineering of complex living systems, the first example that I have here is biorobots, also called xenonbots. And these are systems that are created out of cells but can kind of reconfigure themselves in a robotic manner. Then we have on-chip microfluidic systems, which can look like any of the organs in the body. They're slightly more complicated than just your single sort of cell layer systems. They're more complicated than even a two-cell layer system occasionally. What makes them really cool is that you can kind of plug them into each other, and you can see sort of some of the interactions between different organ-like systems within the body. And these systems are particularly helpful for things like drug development and kind of understanding more kind of complicated interactions. And then finally, the example that I have here today is organoids, which are small organ-like systems, and we're going to spend a little bit of time, a little bit more time sort of talking about them, what they are and what they're useful for. So the central guiding question that I have for us today is, how can we improve the human condition without promoting a worldview where one sees persons as objects or objects as persons? So how do we kind of keep the correct sort of understanding of what a human person is in light of bioengineering? So I want to begin with a couple of bioethicists who I love, Father Ashley and O'Rourke. They're Dominicans, and they wrote a couple of great textbooks on bioethics, but I thought we would start with them on some kind of general guidance for people thinking about kind of ideas relating to human reconstruction. So they begin by telling us that God calls humankind to join with him to share in his creative power through the gift of intelligence. So this is really important. We are called to both stewardship and creativity, to be genuine co-workers with God in an evolutionary process which is not yet complete. So here are a couple of things to note. God doesn't want humans to leave their talents uncultivated. He gave them to us and encourages us to use them to improve the universe. One thing that they note is that Christianity can assimilate a theory of evolution. So within that idea, we're called to join with God in bringing the universe to completion in this creation story. However, they note that human creativity depends on a human brain that we must be very careful to not diminish. Other organs don't quite need to be as protective. For example, they say we could engineer other ways of breathing and maybe not require our lungs in the future. Yeah, a little tricky, but potentially that could be fine. So then, in talking specifically about that cooperation with creation and that call to co-creation, we're given sort of three ideas to sit with and to hold on to. First is that surgery and genetic engineering is good if the risks are taken appropriately into account and don't carry this false ambition. So they don't kind of overpromise for something that might not ever be able to be kind of entirely engineered away. Two things to note, they need to not weaken family ties or diminish kind of our unique and individual personhood. So these are two things that are really important to keep in mind as we're highlighting the good of engineering. Next, we have genetic engineering being permissible if it improves rather than mutilates. So kind of our goal is to continue to improve and not to kind of create something totally different and to kind of ruin God's creation. So here they note that somatic and germline editing are distinct. We need to be much more careful if we're creating, if we're engineering in the germline, which can be continued on into future generations. And then finally, we have the principles of stewardship and creativity, which are really important to enlighten bioengineering. So they have this idea, which I was totally surprised to encounter, which is that natural law is not fixed, but rather our free creative intelligence is the foundation for natural moral law. Persons have not only the right, but the obligation to understand and improve both biological and psychological well-being. So we're called to create a world that is kind of good and better for us. So again here, we're called to good stewardship, where we're called to perfect, but to not destroy what God has created. So as we think about those ideas, I want to get into kind of a case study, something that I've been thinking about for a couple of years, and talk a little bit more about sort of bioengineering and how we might hold on to these principles in these spaces. So I'm going to talk about brain organoid systems, which are also called cerebral organoids. Sometimes they're called mini brains, but these are multicellular systems that resemble organs at the earliest stages of embryonic development. You can see I have a picture of one here. One thing to note is that organoid mini-brains are currently limited by plumbing issues, so they're really small. This is because of lack of vasculature, and it restricts their size to be about the size of the pea. A couple of things to note here. So organoids are small, self-organizing 3D systems of cells that look like the earliest stages of development. You can see here in this photo, let me see if I can use, nope. Yeah, okay. The important thing to note here is that we're comparing sections of a brain and an organoid, and what you can see here is that the patterns look really similar, where we have the green cells on the outside and the red cells on the inside. So these really important kind of structural similarities between brains and organoids make them particularly useful for studying different sort of models of the brain. So given the right growth factors, they can exhibit these structural regions. So you can see they show similar patterns as adult brains, and they can be probed directly while living and growing. So that's what makes them a particularly useful engineering tool. So there are a couple of ethical questions in this space, and I want to start with a few and kind of get into them from a number of different perspectives. So what are some of the ethical protections of growing human tissue? Are there control issues for creating something that's living as opposed to something that's a fixed system? And then finally, this question of future consciousness. Anytime I talk about organoids or related systems, this is a big question that comes up, so we'll talk about that. So I want to begin with human dignity. So what about human dignity? Well, organoids lack an integrated body and thus seem to be not entirely human. A good way to talk about them is to describe them potentially as a human artifact. So an artifact is kind of a category for things that are not totally clear what they are, but they seem to be associated with this other category. A couple of things that we know. Organoids are made out of human cells. They can be made out of human cells. It can be made out of other cells, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They require engineering intervention to provide growth factors and mechanical stimulation to bring about this organ-like structure. But they also have self-organizing principles from their organ-life growth pattern. So each of these three sort of things that we know about organoids requires distinct ethical considerations. So this is a place to begin. Another thing to consider is moral status. So when we're having conversations about what an organoid is and what about human dignity, it's important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about personhood. So personhood is related to moral status. Moral status are beings that have or require intrinsic consideration for their own good and are also called moral persons. So they have a good that is for their own sake. However, moral consideration is an entity that might have interests that should be factored into the decision, things that require consideration for their own sake in terms of sensation of pleasure or pain, or having a self to hold interest. So moral status, full moral status is kind of the highest level of moral consideration. The question of moral status might arise if an organoid has the same cognitive capacity as a human brain. So we were talking a little bit about consciousness. This is related to this question. So kind of further getting into this, another related question is, does an organoid have a rational soul? And if not, can it still have a mind? So here we can begin with Aquinas, who says that rationality is a faculty of the soul. For humans, when we're talking about matter and form, the body is the matter and the soul is the form. The matter exists for the sake of the form, the body exists for the sake of the soul, and not vice versa. So this is a really important point here. The soul has two faculties, the intellect and the will, and the soul cannot be created, but it's something that's instilled by God. It's also immaterial. Here, an organoid could only have a soul if God gave it one. An organoid lacks the growth trajectory of a human embryo. It doesn't have that embodied experience. So it is a different kind of thing. So this is an ontological question that's important to ask, because when asking what kind of thing it is, that's related to this question of whether or not it can have a rational soul. So taking all of this together, it seems like a cerebral or a brain organoid is inadequate as matter for information by a rational soul because it doesn't have the same kind of thingness as a human person. And only human persons have this or are given this rational soul. So then we want to kind of return to this question of consciousness, mind, or memory. So it's really difficult, if not impossible, to probe something immaterial like consciousness. When thinking about kind of the consciousness of an organoid, there is a potential if it's big enough, but not right now. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why I make that claim. So one potential problem that we should be thinking about is this idea of memory. So organoids could potentially be programmed with memories, which would be pretty problematic. This comes from computational models of the brain called connectomics. And one thing to note is that the connectome is a map of how neurons are connected. And so that's what, if we understand this map, it could be something that we could then use to program something like an organoid. So let's get a little bit into connectomics. So connectomics holds this hypothesis that the wiring of the brain is how the mind is encoded. Sebastian Sung, who is a big figure here, says that you are your connectome. So if we can wire an organoid with portions of a connectome, can it replay someone's memories? This is kind of a crazy question, but potentially, given sort of our understanding of neuroscience, could it be something that we could do? Likely, yes. But this requires a couple of things. One, it requires super high resolution images of the brain, and it requires AI and computer vision to trace the wiring. This is because the wiring of the brain is incredibly complex, so about 1 millimeter cube of brain tissue is roughly a petabyte of data, which is a huge amount of data. So that's really important to note, and that high resolution imaging is currently pretty difficult. So as we're kind of considering these questions relating to organoids, and even as we're sort of describing it as potentially a system that we can use to program, could we borrow something like AI ethics to apply to organoid systems? Well, we have this computational model of the brain, this connectome model, which is in alignment with sort of currently what's happening in neuroscience. We've described organoids as providing the neural hardware that can be programmed using that biological reference. One thing to note is that modern AI seeks to replicate specific parts of the brain, like elements of the visual cortex, not the entire thing. And this is really similar to ways that organoids are used, where it's used to kind of replicate parts of the brain, but not the whole thing, particularly given its size limit. Connectomics uses animal models to study neural circuitry for AI use. So this is currently sort of how researchers are kind of navigating ethical questions. They're saying, okay, if we're just concerned with the visual cortex, for example, a rat has a visual cortex, so we don't need to be using human tissue because there's a host of related ethical questions. A couple of things to note here is that AI ethics literature focuses on the provenance of the data used for training. It also focuses on the correctness of the operation of the system and policies regulating specific use cases for this technology. So all of these things are things that can also apply in the organoid context and are something that can and should be borrowed. We will need to reconsider these ethics both for AI and organoids in the future, but it would be speculative to say when, particularly if we're thinking about questions of consciousness that might come up down the line, but we're not totally sure when. If we're talking about current systems, I think these are a good set of guidelines. So a couple of recommendations for ethical biotech research. First, it's currently clear that organoids are not persons. They lack this full moral status. There may be some fear of potential to replay memories of the dead, which is an important consideration and an important ethical consideration that should be navigated. We would say this is unadvised, it's not very respectful of the dead, and it's clearly prohibited in the Bible. Also, going back to the bioethics quotes that I pulled from Ashley and O'Rourke at the beginning, attempts to improve the brain functionality will likely injure or mutilate it because the brain is already a highly sophisticated and very efficient system. So we have to be very careful. But having said that, organoids might be essentials to study diseases of the brain since we can kind of get some of that functionality. Animal organoids are suggested as they sidestep some of these human ethical concerns. And then finally, organoids could be used to run artificial neural networks, which might improve energy use for computation. For things like biological computing, they might allow us to kind of compute faster with less energy, which could be a really cool thing. So I'm going to leave us with this quote from Ethics of Healthcare by Ashley and O'Rourke, which I think does a great job of kind of directing us as bioengineers. So they say that natural law should not be conceived of as a fixed pattern for human life to which human beings are forever confined. Rather, the Creator has made human beings free and intelligent, and it is precisely this intelligent freedom that is human nature and the foundation for moral law. Human intelligence, however, is not disembodied. It depends on a brain and a body that have specific structure. In caring for their total health, persons not only have the right, but the obligation to understand their psychological and biological structure and to improve themselves, even in ways that may seem novel to past generations. Such improvements are good stewardship of the share in divine creativity with which God has endowed humankind. With that, I would like to thank you guys for listening today. Thank you to the Computer Science and Engineering Department and also the Tech Ethics Center. If you guys are interested in connecting, my info is on this slide here, so thank you.
So I'm going to be covering a lot of the same ground in terms of some of the questions involved. Thank you. But I'm going to be stepping from the realm of artifacts into the realm of organisms that do operate as an integrated whole. And I tried to fit a lot in this talk, so buckle up. Let's see if this works. Okay. So in the last 10 years, scientists have placed various components of the human brain into animals of other species, producing mice with human brain cell grafts, rhesus macaques with a key human neurodevelopmental gene, and most recently, cynomolgus monkey embryos with human stem cells inserted into them. The mice with human neural grafts outperformed normal lab mice in learned maze navigation. The genetically modified macaques showed improved reaction time and short-term recall. The human monkey embryos demonstrated cooperation between the human and monkey cell types. These experiments are raising important questions. Before the age of biotechnology, mind found its expression in naturally evolved organic bodies. But now we're creating new bodies that did not evolve as coordinated systems. So how can we discern the moral significance of these new creatures? As developing individuals of one species receive the cells and genes of another, what kind of being results? Could the transfer of neurologically significant human genes, cells, or tissues into a non-human animal cause that animal to be humanized? What is the moral status of such beings? Clarity on the morality of these experiments calls us to return to the perennial questions of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics with increasing urgency. In my view, the biological, and therefore moral, significance of transplanted bodily components, such as genes, cells, or tissue grafts, can only be understood in light of their context within the whole organism and its environment. So as we consider here the case of neural chimeras specifically, we'll seek a broader vision of organismic unity and complexity in order to estimate the mental properties that can be plausibly attributed to a biological entity, especially a novel or ambiguous ones such as interspecies chimeras. So in this presentation, I'll define what chimeras are and note a few key themes in our experimental observations of them. Then, drawing on Aristotelian metaphysics and existential phenomenology, I want to delineate 4 principles that are important for understanding the ontological implications of these experiments. And in the end, I'll close by suggesting 2 guidelines for human-animal chimera research and propose some questions for further inquiry, both experimental and philosophical. So let's begin by defining some terms. So a chimera is an organism produced by combining cells or tissues from at least 2 distinct organisms. The chimera is considered interspecies when the combined cells or tissues were derived from organisms that belong to different species. And note here that chimera is actually a very broad term that it can include not only the mouse with a human neural tissue graft, but also a human patient with a porcine heart valve. It also includes most mothers who, interestingly, it's been noted that even in women who died when they're 80, 90 years old, cells from their pregnancies are noted to continue existing in their brains that somehow crossed the placental barrier and integrated into their organism. So chimeras, they can be created at embryonic stages. One common technique is to inject pluripotent stem cells, not necessarily embryonic stem cells, but they can be, from one organism into the blastocyst of another organism, And a blastocyst is a very early embryonic stage that's pre-implantation. So this technique for producing embryonic chimeras can also be coupled with gene editing. Scientists can inhibit specific developmental programs, such as the generation of a pancreas, by knocking out the genes that control those processes. This creates a developmental niche or a functional vacancy in the embryo, which the injected donor stem cells then are able to occupy. The chimeric organism would then have an organ derived almost entirely from those donor cells. And this technique is called blastocyst complementation. So now that we've defined some terms, I want to point out two important observations that have cropped up in experiments with interspecies chimeras. First, there are many interspecies biological barriers to cellular compatibility. It can be very easy for science fiction to play up the possibility of monstrous, part human, part animal creatures, but the science actually tells a different story. Chimeric experiments have emphasized that it is not so easy to incorporate cells from one species into the body of another. The literature calls these interspecies barriers to biological compatibility. This is because cells compete for survival and signaling dominance. They develop on different time scales, they play different roles, they exist in different states of potentiality, and they utilize different molecular and physical signals. The list goes on and on. So for these reasons, it's been difficult to achieve significant levels of chimerism between all but the most closely related species, such as mice and rats. Human-animal chimeras produced have generally not even survived past very early embryonic stages. So second, experiments also suggest a graft-host paradigm of body-plan dominance. A rat pancreas has been grown inside of a mouse, meaning it was composed almost entirely of rat stem cells, yet the pancreas was still mouse-sized and functional in the mouse's body. The inverse experiment has also been done, with a functional rat-sized, mouse-derived pancreas developed in a rat's body. I especially love this picture. You can see on each side are the wild-type mice and rats, and then the chimeras are there, the two in the center. And you can see that they still basically obey the basic body plan of the wild-type organism. In a particularly striking case, scientists produce a mouse genetically incapable of developing its own gallbladder and injected rat stem cells into it. The chimera grew a mouse-sized gallbladder composed entirely of rat cells. But this is especially amazing given that rats don't have gallbladders. So apparently the cellular microenvironment created by the mouse's developing body influenced the rat stem cells to unlock a gallbladder developmental program that's normally suppressed in rat development. The graft-host paradigm also holds true at the microscopic level. Human stem cells inserted into early-stage cynomolgus monkey embryos began to actually act more like the monkey cells surrounding them than the human cells would have behaved in a normal human embryo. And this was measured by gene expression patterns. So in all of these studies, organismic organization tends toward the stable somatic configurations that have been established through the long continuity of the evolutionary process. Whether because of cell number or type or role, viable chimeric animals have tended to follow a graft-host paradigm of body plan dominance, in which the engrafted donor cells must conform, emphasis there on form, to the basic typology of the host embryo species, or else die. So chimeric experiments not only reveal biological barriers to integrating cells from different species, but also a propensity for cells, both native and donor, to go on organizing according to pre-established blueprints of the body, tried and true systems of structural and functional coherence. A wider frame of view can help us to interpret these experimental results and enable us to understand the moral status of a chimeric organism and estimate properties such as its mental powers. Here I propose, in brief, 4 ontological principles. First, natural kinds do exist. Specifically, humans can and should be distinguished from other animals. As chimeric experiments are showing, natural kinds are manifest in patterns of stable coherence of organismic structure and function. Our species barriers in the laboratory are the interwoven processes of development, genetic, epigenetic, mechanical, chemical, electric, that distinguish organisms from one another and unify their internal operations. So at the level of the mental experience of the organism, these biological constraints also consolidate the psychical possibilities of matter and constrain radical departure from the moral meaning of each species with its distinctive nature and body plan. There have been many proposals to classify the moral status of chimeric organisms according to thresholds of mental capacities. A 2021 committee report by the National Academies of the Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine suggested that morally relevant functional capacities include the possession of pain, consciousness, and emotion, and perhaps more complex abilities such as intentional thought, goal-directed behavior, problem-solving, and self-awareness. I think this is a reasonable starting point for scientists, but it needs to be extended. The functional question is secondary to the ontological one, or in Aristotelian terms, doing follows being. Things behave according to the kind of thing they are. We're not misguided to ground our moral classifications in observations of functional powers. After all, what else do we have to ground our reasoning about these new creatures except our observations of them? But we must remember that functions are indispensable aspects of a moral account of biology, not because things matter because of what they do, but because what they do is a clue to what they are. Beneath function is form. Biological structures and functions are not jumbled haphazardly. Structures and functions tend to co-locate as interweaving features and processes of stable biological systems forged in the relation of environment, felt needs, and goal-oriented drive that's the life of each organism and its community. Because of the complexity of biological life, natural species display nearly omnidimensional evidence of species membership. Everything about the wild-type organism, its genes, proteins, cell types, organs, morphology, behavior, etc., bespeaks its specific identity and way of life. Traits point us to real identities, including species categories. I belabor this point because I think it's important to reaffirm the classical notion of natural kinds without asserting an oversimplified means of discerning them. So the next two principles are interrelated. We cannot forget that the brain and body co-evolved and remain indispensably interdependent. The brain-body relationship unique to each species developed as a morphological and functional unity. And the mental corollary to this claim is that the organismic whole is the locus of mindedness. In other words, we experience with our whole body. And some go as far as to say, there is no brain. There is no such thing as the brain. But I'll say, the organism is the locus of mindedness. So though we colloquially call the brain the organ that thinks, it's more accurate for us to conceptualize the brain as the organ of sensation and movement, whether internal or external sensations or movements, while the body is the frame of reference by which the organism encounters and is encountered within the world, also desires and is desired within the world, knows and is known within the world. And the whole organism is the locus where all that experience is integrated. Sensation, or we might call it feeling, includes not only pain, proprioception, etc., but also emotion. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio characterizes emotion as the brain's way of participating in homeostasis. Homeostatic operations require the interplay of diverse systems, sensing pressure and chemical concentrations, producing and responding to hormonal signals, closing and opening blood vessels, triggering instincts or desires, etc. In its interface with these various physiologic activities, the nervous system generates a multidimensional mapping of the organism's interior. Coupling this with the external senses, which contain information about objects of pain, pleasure, aversion, and appetite, the brain then becomes the integrative organ of feeling or sensation. Movement, another essential aspect of animal life, is also governed by the brain while still dependent on the musculoskeletal and other systems. And note that there's a dynamic relation between movement and feeling. Movement is guided and governed by feeling. Feeling orients and urges movement. The brain's participation in homeostasis, feeling, is meaningless without the ability to reach toward an object of desire or revolt from an object of dread. If feeling is the embedding of mind in the world, movement is mind's expression in the world. Without both essential contextual aspects, as perhaps with organoids or artificial intelligence, which are two basic prerequisites for intentionalities, movement and feeling, mindedness does not make sense. But brains alone are not sufficient for biological mindedness. Moving and feeling are functionally paired only in the life of a whole organism, or perhaps in certain synthetic approximations. And the phenomenologist Hans Jonas points out that moving and feeling bridge the rift between subject and object, and thereby come to underlie the minds of animal organisms with all their appetites, desires, fears, inclinations, habits, and responses. At the same time, the body frames the kinds of possibilities for sensation, movement, and mind. For example, as Erwin Strauss illustrates in his work in phenomenological psychology, the upright posture of human existence transforms forelimbs into arms that can be used for reaching, holding, and manipulating, actions that take on psychological and spiritual meaning in the unified psychophysical totality of the human organism. Think also of pain, which, although is a basic neural function shared by many species, bears a distinctive existential dimension in human experience. So these principles bring us to a final one, that human morphology, in all its variation, including the various types and degrees of disabilities, human morphology is normative for morally inviolable forms of embodied mindedness. Among biological systems known to exist, only the human body plan, again in all its variation, has demonstrated the ability to support modes of interpreting and engaging the environment that allow the natures, purposes, and meanings of things to be understood. And the culmination of these abilities is our capacity to recognize persons, to perceive the subject who is the object of our attention. In you and I, sensation and movement are refracted through the prism of human form, becoming understanding and creativity. But understanding and creativity extend the more basic animal powers of sensation and movement to such a degree of intellectual abstraction that it is right to call the human mind qualitatively matchless among biological species. Metaphor plays an important role in this transfiguration of feeling and motion to intellection and creation. Our language is grounded in bodily metaphors that allow us to leap from particular experiences, memories, and imaginations to the abstractions of thought that allow us to piece together coherent stories and develop meaningful relationships with one another. So this kind of mindedness has only been achieved in the human form, and perhaps only the human form, or something very similar to it, can sustain it. In the biological world, diverse body plans often contain analogous parts for similar functions. Think about the compound eye for sight, the wing for flight, suggesting that optimal solutions to biological problems do exist, and that biology does have a reliable tendency to achieve those solutions. That there appears to be no organism on Earth whose mindedness is analogous to ours suggests that the human form has found the optimal solution for coordinated comprehension and flexibility of intention. So I conclude by proposing 2 guidelines for human-animal chimera research and several questions for further inquiry. First, if human-animal chimeras are produced, the body plan of the non-human species must be clearly dominant. And by body plan, I refer to a stable species characteristic, developmental, morphologic, and physiologic system. And second, we should not be producing neural chimeras between humans and non-human primates, including embryonic chimeras in which human stem cells may contribute to the developing non-human primate brain. Now, this guideline I think is kind of interesting because I think this would be a prudential restriction, not necessarily a principled one. It's not clear that human, non-human primate chimeras would definitely cross an ontological threshold. After all, to achieve stable, healthy neural chimerism with human stem cells is difficult to achieve in any non-human species, and I think this would include primates. Beyond the embryonic stage, the operations of any surviving human neurons or glia would be heavily influenced by the other species' cranial microenvironment, anatomical structures, molecular signals, electrical and mechanical processes, not to mention all the processes by which synaptic connections are pruned, promoted, and positioned through the developing organism's exercise of its sensory and motor abilities. Yet at the same time, it may be impossible for us at this point to guarantee that any one human primate non-neurologic chimera would not demonstrate the higher order development of mind that we exhibit. We don't yet understand the morally relevant biological dividing lines between humans, our modern primate relatives, and our common ancestor. So we shouldn't risk recapitulating any key genetic or structural turning points in evolution by tinkering with human primate chimeras. Not to mention that much of the public finds this idea repulsive to begin with. Finally, some proposals for future research. Questions such as, can we define what constellations of observable biological properties do constitute a human organism? What species-specific traits and abilities are morally relevant and why? Which bodily and neurologic features of humanity support these morally relevant traits and abilities? And what neural structures and properties undergird our human-specific thought processes, especially language? And then one experimental way forward that I have proposed is to start by creating fully non-human interspecies neural chimeras to see how the integration of, say, rat stem cells into a mouse's brain would affect the behavior of a mouse. Would it adopt any rat-like characteristics? How does neural chimerism even work? Let's not jump straight to human-animal neural chimerism. Let's start with non-human species. But the wide scope of all these questions makes it clear we need an anthropological inquiry that's interdisciplinary, involving biology, psychology, philosophy, theology, and more. So I'm glad that we have all of you here in the room to help us tackle these questions. Thank you.
So today I have the privilege of speaking on the Thomistic metaphysics of creation as a corrective to Transhumanism's Technocratic Paradigm. Now, there are a lot of words in that title and some jargon, so I'd like to unpack that in the next 20 minutes or so. And in this brief presentation, I'd like to follow three main stages. So first off, I want to simply clarify some terms and some concepts and show how some apparently unrelated ideas can actually influence each other. Second, I want to outline very briefly a methodology for dialogue between two very different traditions, different worldviews, if you will, namely Tomism and the secular school of transhumanism. And finally, I want to explain more concretely why this very speculative philosophical issue of the metaphysics of creation can actually and should eventually inform some very practical ethical decisions we need to make about biotechnology. So it's an ambitious project, but I'll do my best to give you the outlines here and welcome questions and further dialogue. So I imagine many of us are familiar with the notion of creation, and if you're not, you have 3 days to learn more. And then regarding Thomism, I imagine many of us are at least vaguely familiar with Thomas and his disciples, and we'll come back to this Thomistic school and its relevance more toward the end of the presentation. So first off, transhumanism. For those unfamiliar with this increasingly influential movement, we can turn to Nick Bostrom, who I think is the leading philosopher of this school. He teaches at Oxford University and has a very influential Future of Humanity Institute there. And he was also kind enough to, with other authors, write a frequently asked question document, an FAQ document about transhumanism, where he lays out, I think clearly, the fundamental goals of this movement. He considers transhumanism this intellectual, social, cultural movement to radically enhance humanity, especially in the cognitive, mood, moral, physical, and lifespan categories. But this radical enhancement of our different characteristics is itself understood, according to most transhumanists, as a transition phase pointing toward a post-human state, a post-human existence of superior beings, presumably. Those who have been fully liberated from the constraints of the body. Because usually this lump of flesh is associated with the setbacks and sufferings that we have to put up with in life. So there are aspirations of freeing us from a physical substrate to achieve perhaps even a kind of digital immortality. Now, the technocratic paradigm that Pope Francis has spoken of and Romano Guardini and many others have spoken of is an older reality than contemporary transhumanism. Technocratic paradigm can be seen in this kind of evacuation of meaning, of finality in our environment. So our surroundings, the world no longer has a kind of inbuilt purpose. There are no longer any purposes or a teleology in the world around us, nor in human nature itself. Any sort of purpose or goal that we might find is itself invented, you could say perhaps even imposed by human creativity. We're the ones who are left to shape the world and human nature around us. And the best tools at our disposal are technological tools. Now, you can find this in Francis Bacon, you can find it re-emerging in many different movements, but I contend that transhumanism is the most contemporary, newest concrete expression of this tendency. We could take, for example, a close collaborator of Bostrom, Anders Sandberg, who also works at Oxford University. And he's popularized a notion of morphological freedom. Basically, we have this kind of right to full autonomy in making decisions about how we'll use technological developments to alter, perhaps radically, our bodies. And this approach is sort of unrestrained by any notion of teleology, any constricting understanding of human nature. Now, it seems to me that there's a bit of a value systems problem here. If we leave these kind of important bioethical decisions about emerging technologies to the personal autonomy of each individual, it seems like we're setting ourselves up to a lot of conflict, and we don't have any common standards to navigate these issues together as a society. And my fears about this value systems problem were in many ways confirmed when I spoke briefly with Sandberg at a transhumanist event in Spain last year. And I raised this issue, and he responded to me in a very friendly, admirable, amiable way. Well, yes, you can be a utilitarian transhumanist. You could be a Kantian transhumanist. You could be a conservative transhumanist. He was aware of my doctoral research, so he said, don't worry, you could even be a Thomistic transhumanist. So he was very kind and open-minded about the different flavors of transhumanism. But this left me a bit distressed, right? Because it seems like we come to quite a bit of subjectivism. Very intelligent, brilliant men and women who, in my opinion, have fallen to a sophisticated form of preference satisfaction, which can go awry if not guided. I also think there's a very deep underlying problem philosophically. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is therapy, what is enhancement. We try to navigate questions about which forms of biotechnology are helpful to us. But I contend that this technocratic paradigm in transhumanism and its radical subjectivism and exaltation of personal autonomy leaves us incapable of even speaking of enhancement. Because normally when we talk about enhancement, we are referring to an improvement. We're making, at least implicitly, a value judgment. I think that at best, these thinkers can describe change. They cannot really offer us this sort of value judgment about what is an enhancement, what is improving humanity, and what is not. So we come to a fairly distressing picture of some leading thinkers in fundamental questions of the use of biotechnology. Is there some sort of alternative model to understand human improvement and enhancement? Well, I think there is, and I devoted a few years to researching the possibility that perhaps the Thomistic philosophical tradition can offer a more robust understanding of the human person and the kind of human perfection or improvement or flourishing that is at work in the secular transhumanist movement. Now, we are dealing with moral strangers, to borrow a phrase from the great bioethicist Tristan Engelhardt, right? Groups of individuals who have very different starting points and perspectives about how to make moral judgments. It's very easy for us to talk past each other. It's very easy, perhaps, to use the same terms with very different meanings. So I draw on the great Alistair MacIntyre to propose a kind of tradition-constituted inquiry approach, and I certainly can't unpack it all here, but I want to find common ground between these two movements. I think there are at least shared aspirations to improve humanity, to overcome the setbacks that we face, sickness, suffering, aging, death, to move to a kind of perfection, or at least a step toward flourishing. But at the same time, I think that there are some difficulties and limitations, severe limitations to this outlook. But before coming to thump my Bible or my copy of the Summa Theologiae, I want to offer what I think are critiques based on the inner tensions or contradictions within the movement itself, according to their own standards, right? So there's a lot that can be said there, but I think, for instance, of Julian Savulescu's proposal of the principle of procreative beneficence. I actually spoke on that last year here at the fall conference. And it's the idea that we should harness something like in vitro fertilization and embryo selection to create the best children with the best chance of the best life, right? We may not be able to achieve the kind of designer babies that we might read about in magazines, but we can at least get a better selection, if you will. Now, I think that according to his own proposed worldview neutrality on these matters and respect for people's individual choices, and his own proposed desire to avoid metaphysical questions, he unfortunately falls into some pretty strong metaphysical affirmations, like, for instance, regarding the identity of human embryos and their absence from this community of moral personhood. Now, we can argue about whether he's right or wrong, but at the very least, what I want to point out is that he is making a strong metaphysical claim, even though his own movement claims to avoid such affirmations. Likewise, transhumanism is very interested in the exaltation of personal autonomy. And yet, in this principle, it seems that the personal autonomy of a small minority, namely the reproducers who can afford this technology, is overriding and disregarding the personal autonomy of this wide group of embryos who may or may not be selected, and even if selected, will be fundamentally conditioned by the exercise of autonomy of their reproducers. So in short, I think that C.S. Lewis's observation in The Abolition of Man is quite applicable here, that this effort, the technocratic paradigm effort, if you will, to achieve man's conquest of nature very often ends up being man's conquest of other men with nature as an instrument. So there are these tensions and limits, and I think that eventually we can turn to another movement like Thomism to think seriously about questions of human flourishing and the right use of technology. And here I draw heavily on the natural moral law tradition and the virtue ethics tradition here. And I think that Thomism is especially helpful, I know that Megan alluded to this, in helping us to appreciate that natural moral law is not meant to simply enshrine a set of biological characteristics, but rather helps us to appreciate an inner dynamism to these, to borrow from another reference made in the last presentation, these natural kinds, right? Nature is this intrinsically purposeful kind that is fulfilled through certain functions, right? And that's something that Thomism highlights very well. So I also propose with a few other Thomists that perhaps even enhancements, biotechnological enhancements, could be acceptable. Not only therapies, but enhancements, in the sense that that which brings us beyond the statistical norm of biological health could be incorporated into a good life. Because again, we do not reduce human nature to a strictly biological category. But I think even if we are to incorporate forms of enhancement into the good, flourishing life, there's a very important subsequent question. Are we going to use this enhancement well or poorly? Which is precisely where virtue ethics can help us to navigate. Because without prudence, we can turn any sort of biological boost into a tool of abuse or manipulation. Think, for instance, if we were to achieve a superior state of memory, right? I could very well use that memory to benefit from better facial recognition, right? I'm seeing people that I haven't seen for a year, and I'm having awkward situations where I say, I think I saw you last year, but what was your name again? Whereas with superior memory, perhaps I could more easily connect with others. I could expand my field of friendships. I could deepen my friendships and benefit from that tremendous enriching good. Or, on the other hand, if I'm a vicious person, I could use the superior memory to manipulate you, right? So these questions of enhancement also raise very perennial questions of what the good life looks like. And I think Thomism can offer us a lot. Now, I think there's a kind of epistemological autonomy in what we're talking about from a consideration of the creator, right? I haven't forgotten the theme of the conference, right? So we can analyze a lot of matters of the good moral life without explicit reference to the creator, to God. However, there is, I'm convinced, and I imagine all Thomists would agree, a profound ontological dependence on these issues of natural moral law and virtue ethics. And so the teleology, the purposes, the goods, the very normativity of human nature that we are proposing to navigate biotechnological use is best accounted for if we eventually arrive at a creator, at an author of this human nature, at one who is capable of inscribing this grammar in creation. Now, are we simply asking these non-believing secular transhumanists to make what would seem to them to be an irrational act of faith? Well, no. Thomas helps us very much because he provides not only a very rich theology of creation, but he provides a fascinating philosophy of creation. Note that I mentioned a metaphysics of creation. So, what does Thomas, a 13th century friar, have to say to us? Did he have a sneak peek at Big Bang cosmology or alternative models? Well, no. But he wasn't wrestling with these temporal questions. He wasn't looking at issues, fascinating issues, about the temporal finitude of the universe. He famously argued that even if, theoretically, the universe did not have a kind of temporally first moment, there would still be a need for a creator. Thomas is not just looking for that first big domino that knocks down the other dominoes in a chronological sequence. He often wrote, "Creatio non est mutatio." Creation doesn't refer to just a process of change, but rather it's the conferral of being in the present moment. Here and now, we need a better account of why there is something rather than nothing. And so Thomas does not look to the telescope to analyze this matter of creation. He looks at the contingent beings around him, all of these finite, limited, transitory beings that go in and out of existence, that exist but might not have existed. And he ponders, he contemplates this reality. We can look even in ourselves and realize, well, we had a beginning moment and we do not account for our own present existence. Now, he wonders, what if perhaps we can just look to enough causes around us to account for being? What if we just had a complicated enough network to support each other? So just kind of for the simplicity, to wrap our minds around this, we could imagine, for instance, there's an A causing a B, causing a C, and C causes A. Okay, well, the network's taken care of. But the problem here is, we begin to think about it more, C is depending on B, which is depending on A, which means C really depends on A. But we already said A also depends on C, and we're talking about the present moment. In a sense, we have an absurd situation of self-causation, proposing that there could be beings that are actual in order to cause, but at the same time potential in order to be caused. And so no multiplication of these causes of these finite contingent beings can account for or possess in this moment the being necessary to exist and cause others. So Thomas here, and again, I can hardly do justice to his profound reflections in a 20-minute presentation, but he gives us a pathway to consider seriously the possibility that we can break out of the immanent frame of the technocratic paradigm, that there is a higher cause, there is a creator. And if that's the case, there are very good grounds to think more seriously about teleology, to think of beyond the purposes that we invent and begin to consider that there may be purposes that we are to discover. And so it's interesting because many critics of transhumanism in the more secular sphere speak of the need to return to a givenness of human nature, to the giftedness of human nature. I think of Michael Sandberg and his fascinating work. But secular critics fire back. This, like Art Kaplan or Peter Singer, this talk of a giftedness of human nature doesn't make sense without some sort of transcendent giver. And I'm inclined to agree with these secular critics. And so I think we can ground this talk of the giftedness of human nature if we begin to consider the transcendent giver. Now, certainly the metaphysics of creation does not in and of itself provide the whole rich view of the natural moral law and virtue ethics, but I think it makes that model and that framework intelligible. And so this metaphysics of creation that Thomas and his school offers brings us beyond this constricting, reductive view of human fulfillment that's found in transhumanism in particular and in the technocratic paradigm in general, so that we can find a more reliable path to true human flourishing. Thank you for your attention.